Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the Musings from the Mount podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Carenza. In this episode, we are exploring the powerful distinction between kindness and criticism. We'll dig into how our thoughts become energetic forms with lives of their own, and why criticism can function like a poison, not just for others, but for ourselves. We'll challenge the old idea that you have to be cruel to be kind, and examine what it means to practice clarity with compassion, especially in our increasingly caustic social environment. So, whether you're struggling with self-criticism or navigating difficult conversations, this exploration of mindful communication might just change how you approach your next challenging interaction. And we hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you do enjoy these podcasts, please consider going to meditationmount.org and donating. Your donation helps us to bring you this podcast, as well as all the other programs that Mount produces, both today and in the future. We're incredibly grateful and honored by your support. Now back to the podcast and being clear to be kind. I just wanted to start out with, and I just read this to Michael before we started, but this quote that I found we're doing some research for this episode. And it really struck with me because we at Meditation Mount, one of the things we talk about a lot is the power of thought and a thought form, and that energy follows thought. And if you're not used to thinking of thoughts as having a life of their own or energy of their own, then this quote might strike you as odd or interesting. And it definitely did for me. And that the quote is from the Treatise on Cosmic Fire. And it's, "The thought forms which we create and send out into the world are the children of our minds, and as such, they have a life of their own." And that stuck with me. I mean, when you think about anyone that's been in a group before or had to lead groups or had to be part of an organization, you can see how the negativity of even one person can work its way through the group almost like a cancer. Or if you were to drop food coloring into an aquarium or a bowl, and you see that it spreads out and taints everything. And when we decided to talk about kindness and criticism as a theme for this episode, it just brought up so much for me, and I was excited to talk about it. And but one of the things that Michael said to me right before we started is he was talking about the difference between a critique and criticism. And I think maybe if we just start there, because this is a lot of it has to do with intentionality. I think a lot of it has to do with, I was talking about the inherent danger of any society. So like if you're in a group and you're living hand to mouth, perhaps you're hunter-gatherers, your criticisms or critiques will be much more pointed and much more forceful than if you have more room to play. There's maybe you live in a high-trust society. And then I also really wanted to maybe talk about like how the intentionality and mindfulness, how that factors into all of this.
Intentionality, but it goes back to what is the intent? Is the purity of intent behind my action? So you name the thought as a living entity. Mm-hmm. It is. And that's what we don't realize, that everything we think comes into being. It's if God created the universe, then we create our own universe of lives every time we think something potently and send it out. Mm-hmm. And it only dissolves when we pull the energy from it. Mm. Others can add to it. Yeah. They pile on. But to go back to the original question, the difference between criticism and critique, probably the clearest example I can give is that every month I write an article or an essay for the Meditation Mount newsletter, and I always ask several people to critique it, to help me make it more useful, more relevant, anything that would enhance it. It isn't, I'm not expecting people to say, well, Michael, you're a lousy writer, or, that's not the point. It may well be that I'm not the most brilliant. But what I'm asking for is, can you help me make this more useful? Can you help me enhance it, make it better? I'm asking you to use your wisdom, your insight to help me. Mostly criticism is what I don't like about you, what I don't like about what you said, why I disagree with you. And what we'll get into later is some of the esoteric reasons why criticism and negativity are poisons that are polluting the atmosphere. And we'll also draw upon the writing of Roberto Assagioli. Dr. Assagioli is the inspiration behind Meditation Mount. He was a psychologist. He wrote a lot about the effects, the psychic effects of criticizing, particularly inside a group. And so I'd like to draw upon that. But the reason why I felt it was important to cover today, because when I look around the world, when I look at a news broadcast or read anything, the way that people are talking about each other is virulent. It's virulent speech.
And welcome to Twitter, X,
Yes, and X marks the spot.
Yeah.
And it does, yeah. Yes, and it's very difficult to remove spots sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one larger reason. The other reason is that criticism is one of the easiest traps that I can fall into. If there's a weakness in my system that I haven't totally healed yet, is this path of least resistance to slide down into criticism. It's a natural thing of using the mind to compare. And then if you're not feeling good about yourself or somebody else, the comparison becomes, if you like, a denigrating statement. It's degenerative. So I'd like to look at that. But I wondered, is there anything else you want to say as we sort of go through the doorway of, as you say, kindness and criticism?
Well, there is one, old axiom that I would like to maybe just kind of pin up to sort of think about as we go through this, is that, there's this old concept that you have to be cruel to be kind. And I think that what we're doing, not only here at Meditation Mount, but in our own personal work, I know in my own personal work, is almost been a lifelong, before I was even conscious of it, a lifelong crusade to find a different way of making that not as effective or not as true or not as, because I noticed with myself growing up very early that I didn't respond well to that type of feedback, but that I did respond incredibly well to other types, and I understand that there was a time and a place where that was the prevailing thought, that you had to be cruel to be kind. But I'm wondering if we can't, using some of these teachings, maybe find a different path or a different way to think about that.
That's a great example, because I think that still holds sway, that thought form, spare the rod, spoil the child.
Yeah.
I grew up with that one in Britain.
Yeah, I did too here.
But the whole thing of you got to be cruel to be kind, that somehow is a self-justification for being nasty and unkind and unloving. I believe you have to be truthful to be kind. But first of all, you've got to be true to yourself, to thine own self be true. Yeah. Therefore, you've got to do your own inner work, and you've got to do your own forgiveness and your own growing. Now, if you're self-critical, you're going to give yourself a hard time.
Yeah.
You think criticism of others is bad. What about being the self-critic?
Yeah. Oh, that's one area that I definitely struggle in. And I wish I remember the lady's name who did a TED Talk, but she had a great line that she was saying she felt a better adage was, you have to be clear to be kind.
And that's what I mean by truthful. It's everything is clear. Well,
that was a huge change for me just in my own personal life. And this is something that happened, I guess, relatively later in life, is that I changed my own way of interacting to become, to work towards clarity. And there's a way you can, I think people appreciate that too, when you're clear with them, even if it's something they don't necessarily want to hear. It's if you're clear about it and you're kind about it, it lands in such a better way.
Well, it goes back to seek first to understand before seeking to be understood.
Right. That's good too. That's good too. I also think that if you are in a position where you are the person, for whatever reason, whether you are offering critique or criticism, or whether it's your job or whether you're a parent or you're a friend. And I like to think sometimes about timelines. And for me, I always stressed about this has to happen right now. And then I noticed that when some of my mentors were able to hold the space for me to grow in over a course of many years, and I was like, okay, so if you can take that sort of view of like, is this the most important thing for me to say right now in this moment? And 9 times out of 10, it's not the most important thing to say right now, and maybe not even the most helpful. And I think that goes back to mindfulness and really getting ourselves into a place where we're really being mindful, and like trying to do no harm,
Well, we're going to be quoting from the Ponder on this book, which is a compilation of some of DK's quotes. I want to go straight to one of them because it's just what you talked about. We'll get to it. It says, one of the major faults of disciples today is the paying of too close attention to the faults, errors, and activities of other disciples, and too little attention to their own fulfillment of the law of love and to their own dharma and work. Today, the neophyte must learn the same lesson of attention to personal perfection and to personal work through the means of that inner silence, which broods over the disciple and forces him to attend to his own work and business, leaving others to do the same, and so learn the lesson of experience. A great deal of present right activity is hindered by the speech interplay between disciples, and much time is lost through wordy discussion of the work and activities of other disciples. Humanity as a whole needs silence at this time as never before. It needs time in which to reflect and the opportunity to sense the universal rhythm. Modern disciples, if they are to do their work as desired and to cooperate with the divine plan correctly, need that inner reflective quiet, which in no way negates intense outer activity, but which does not release them from wordy criticisms, feverish discussions, and constant preoccupation with the Dharma, the motives, and the methods of their fellow disciples. Sort of, it's a spiritual mind your own business kind of thing.
It really is. And it's such a counterpoint to the concept of silence and space to what we have now, which is 24/7 nonstop information and opinions. So I think that's an interesting concept. And it's something also I noticed too. It's one of the things in the sort of esoteric spiritual community. There is a lot of critiquing and a lot of opinion sharing about what other people are doing.
Well, it's one of the glamours of the mental body.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I'm going to show you some cleverness here.
Yeah.
I have a clever mind. Let me show you. And I will show you that I'm wiser or cleverer than somebody else. I can put them down.
Mm-hmm.
I put my friends down, my colleagues down, in order to put myself in a greater light.
Right.
And this is where I wanted to sort of draw from some of the things that the Tibetan, the Master DK, has written in particularly in the Ponder on this compilation, but also one of his direct students was Roberto Assagioli. So Roberto then took it down into the world of psychology, and he wrote a paper on personal development. And this is the chapter 18 of this sort of book on personal development that Dr. Assagioli wrote. He said, what we are witnessing here is moral mutilation, which is in a sense more serious than physical mutilation. And those responsible for causing such states in others have much to answer for. The only excuse they can claim is that they are often unaware of the harm they are doing, but the time has come for such psychological crimes to cease. Everyone must come to realize that criticism, disparagement, pessimism, and forecasts of failure are nothing less than poisons, whereas loving understanding, appreciation, and encouragement and a healthy optimism are life-giving. They summon dormant energies and can lead to a wonderful inner blossoming and to precious works. So that's how he sort of sums it up, saying, look, do you realize that criticism, the way you're practicing it now, is just poisoning the atmosphere? And if I could just read one more paragraph that he wrote here. He said, we will now examine another of the greatest obstacles stand in the way of spiritual development, the tendency towards personal self-affirmation and the aggressive ways in which this manifests itself. It can take various forms, some impulsive in nature, others of a more calculated type. We will then take them together because it is often the case that emotional elements and mental elements coincide within us in a complex fashion. Among the manifestations of aggression, we might mention antagonism in its various forms. Then he lists these 6: anger, rage, resentment, condemnation, reproach, and criticism. So he talks a lot about anger, and it's like a boomerang. You throw it, it'll come back and hit you at some point. But what he says about anger and its effects, he says, another harmful effect of anger is that it plays a decisive role in the production of poisons in our system. These poisons are also produced by resentment, which we might regard as a chronic irritation. I think it appropriate, however, that I focus our attention on one aspect of the fighting instinct, which, because it is so subtle and insidious, because it is so widespread, and because of its serious harmful effects, deserves special attention. That is the area of criticism. The tendency, and then in parentheses, indeed, I might even call it a universal mania, to blame and belittle our fellow human beings at every opportunity. And then he offers a possible explanation. Let's try to understand why this tendency is so widespread and so strong. Why is it that people who in other respects have good moral qualities devote themselves with a passion, I would even say with enthusiasm, to criticizing others, and in so doing, experience a real pleasure throughout their being, as shown by the inflection of their voice, the animation of their gestures, and the twinkle in their eye?
Yeah.
You get off on it.
Yeah, we know that. We all know one of those people. And that's a tough one, and especially when those people tend to gravitate towards power.
So well, exactly. But one thing that Dr. Assagioli offers from a psychological perspective, he said, look, this is what he believes. In the first place, criticism satisfies our self-affirmation instinct. Discovering and pointing out the shortcomings and weaknesses of others gives us a pleasurable sense of superiority, as well as pleasantly bolstering our pride and arrogance. In the second place, it provides an immediate outlet for our aggressive energies, and while giving us all the satisfaction of an easily won victory, free from any danger because the enemy is not present, it seems no more than a harmless pursuit. Often, in fact, we feel it our duty to criticize, so it is not subject to any check or inner censure, and our moral conscience is taken in. And then finally, he said, and curious as it may seem, criticism serves to satisfy the desire for communion with others, though it is only partially successful and destructive in its effect. This apparent paradox should not surprise us too much indeed. What can most readily unite and reconcile people and groups of human beings, it is having a real or assumed enemy in common. We should not be surprised, therefore, that people are all too eager for the pleasurable fellowship and agreement that comes from sharing their criticisms of others. This is not true fellowship or union. However, it is merely a temporary, superficial coming together because it is based on separateness and not on unity. So he sort of wraps it up with that bow.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there, Joey.
Yeah, especially, man, if you ever have to work with any kind of group dynamic stuff, this is the stuff that seems to trip up most groups, organizations, even friendships.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed, as I matured and became, is when I would notice other people's relationships, particularly romantic relationships. And one of the things that I always found to be a little disturbing, I didn't like it when one person in the relationship would make fun of the other person when they weren't around, and then I always thought that was an interesting, dynamic, whereas, and again, the kind of relationship I never really wanted to be a part of is that, just this, and we find that camaraderie. It's like a camaraderie you have when you're making fun of somebody.
Because you're bonded at the lower level.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you and I know, in the community that is addicted,
Mm-hmm.
what glues you together is not the love of the soul or the call of service, higher service. It's your fellowship in a substance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that's unfortunately one of the hard parts for me about the general 12-step recovery programs. That's where for me, I found them a little bit lacking, is that it seemed to want to ground you and kind of keep you in this identification, and
Well, you and I have had this conversation before.
Yeah.
I remember we had it in a car one day
Yeah.
driving from Los Angeles. 12-step programs and affirmations are positive.
Mm-hmm.
How long do I have to say I am an alcoholic, or I am a whatever substance abuser, or I am? Because those are patterns. When I have overcome the patterns, what has been re-revealed is the truth of who I am without that overlay. Therefore, isn't it time for me to say, I am a soul currently moving through some tough challenges, but the affirmation of who I am as my identity.
Yeah.
The addiction is my current challenge, which I have yet to overcome fully, but my identity is beyond that. So for me, I would say the limitation would be giving life to that thought form, because as you said at the beginning of this podcast, that is a child of our thought.
Right.
And we sent it out into the world, and it's basically saying, I'm an addict,
Mm-hmm.
rather than I am an incarnated soul on earth that is temporarily addicted to this substance and is doing its best to get through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very different way of holding it.
And it's interesting how this stuff comes back to this concept of energy follows thought and these thought forms. And, when so much of it for me, and it seems like in general, revolves around mindfulness. And I did find a quote. It said, mindfulness is the process of paying attention to the present moment, and compassion is the process of paying attention to the present moment with kindness. And that was from the unfinished autobiography. And I thought, because that for me has a lot to do with time and timelines. Like this development of mindfulness and this able to exist in the moment and not be wrapped up in the moment, swept away by the moment, where you lose yourself, or you lose your ability to be kind.
Well, you say you get swept away. I'm thinking that when I and you and we engage in these conversations of criticism, it's as though we get emotionally charged, and these emotional waters, like a tidal wave, we get swept away with it. It's only when the higher mind steps in and says, time out, this is not what we agreed to.
Yeah.
I go back to this distillation of the Buddhist teaching, which I repeat to myself whenever I find myself sort of straying a little. And it's a very simple statement. Think, say, and do that which is kind, helpful, and true. Think, say, and do that which is kind, helpful, and true. So that's the checklist. So maybe I'm quiet for a few seconds before I speak in order to say, where am I coming from? Is this helpful to this person? Or am I doing it because I want to get one over on them?
Well, that's a good point, because one of my questions I wanted to ask was, in making this relatable, is like, how can we balance honesty and kindness when we're communicating with others, especially when it's something difficult? Like, it's or it's a confrontational situation. Like how do we actually manage that? What does that look like to, when something needs to be conveyed and it's something that's important and it's timely, and how do you do that with kindness?
It goes back to what's my intent.
Mm-hmm.
If my intent is the good of the whole and what I'm doing is not adding to that, and somebody can point out, Michael, are you aware that what you're doing just caused this, rather than saying, you jerked, you realize just what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody can do that with love to help, not just me, but to help the group, then you are free to declare that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's useful. It goes back to think, say, and do that which is kind, helpful, and true. Well, is it helpful? Well, let me think. Is it true? Yes, it's true. I've just observed this.
Mm-hmm.
Helpful? Yes, it will be helpful. Can I do it in a kind way?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that you can't say anything. And that's what I've experienced in some groups, and I won't name the communities that I've experienced them in because I don't want to sort of name names and be critical of them. But what I'm using is saying this is the stage of development that we're at this time of. There was this some agreement that you're not allowed to criticize anybody. You're not allowed to say anything negative because you will hurt their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Not because it wasn't true and wasn't helpful, because you'd hurt their feelings, and we're not allowed to hurt each other's feelings.
Mm.
And I'm going, no, we're here to help each other grow as souls. Our feelings sometimes get in the way, or as we said before, the distinction between feelings and emotions, our emotional charge sometimes gets in the way of the soul expressing itself or us seeing each other soul to soul. And so I've found in these groups where something is like the elephant in the room. Nobody dare name it because they're going to be accused of, oh, you can't say that because that's offensive to that person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may be offensive to the soul in some pure way that this part of the personality through which they're trying to function is not up to the task.
Mm-hmm.
So if we help each other grow so that the soul of our one humanity can express through us, that's a different reason and rationale for doing something that, hey, I want to show that I'm right, you're wrong, and this is one way for me to put you down.
Right.
It can't be a put down, Joey.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be an upliftment of the field. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's tricky because somebody I take offense at that.
Right.
That means you've just hurt my emotions. And my soul may be jumping up and down going, yeah, finally somebody gave you the truth.
Yeah.
So it's a very tricky one. And the Tibetan talks about criticism in groups. He said, it'll be obvious to you that the first and most important of these difficulties will be those arising from group criticism, either voiced or strongly felt. This criticism can be based on many things, but it is usually rooted in jealousy, thwarted ambition, or pride of individual intellect.
Mm.
Each member of any group, particularly those in the immediate circle of the leader or leaders, is prone to sit in judgment. The responsibility is not theirs. They know not the problems as they truly exist, and criticism is therefore easy. It should here be remembered that criticism is a virulent poison. It damages in every case eventually the one who criticizes, owing to the fact of voiced direction. Energy follows thought. It hurts still more the one who is criticized. Where there is purity of motive, true love, and a large measure of detachment, the subtler bodies of the one who is under attack may remain immune, but the physical effects will be definite. And where there is any physical weakness or limitations, there will be found the localization of the projected poison.
Mm.
I mean, so it isn't just, I grew up with the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Mm-hmm. Well, he's basically saying, but if you call somebody a name with the intent to harm, it's a poison. It will get you at some point. Unless you're absolutely squeaky clean and pure, then there's no entry point.
Yeah. It's also that old saying, taking poison and expecting someone else to die. You're poisoning your own field, your own well, your own life force when you're doing this. And I know this can be a really, really tough one for people to wrap their heads around. And this might be one of the harder spiritual sort of lessons or axioms to sort of adopt, because there's definitely a counterintuitiveness to it.
Right. Well, there's another aspect that the Tibetan points out. He says, unvoiced criticism is very dangerous, for it is powerfully focused and strongly, though not individually directed, it issues continuously and as a steady stream, sent forth on the wings of jealousy, ambition, pride in a personal grasp of a supposed situation, and a belief that the one who criticizes is in a position to understand correctly and could, given right opportunity, take right action. Where the criticism is voiced and expressed in words, it is consequently strengthened by the cooperation of those influenced by the criticism, and the consequences of this group-directed thought may result in the physical undoing and disruption of the physical body of the leader or leaders. This may be a new thought to some and should cause many in the groups to arrest their thoughts and so release their leaders from the disastrous impact of their criticism. So he's just saying that thoughts are powerful because they contain energy. This energy is conditioned by what we put into it. And if it's a little bit of hate and a little bit of nastiness, then that is the chemical compound that is going to hit the person when they receive the thought. It's like throwing acid in your face.
Yeah. Or in this case, managing your cortisol, it really is.
Well, we go back to the C's. You've got cortisol, and but what you've got then is you've got virulent thoughts being corrosive, caustic.
Yeah.
And they cause harm.
They do.
And what happens when these things precipitate from the inner realms to the outer? They show up in our body as a sickness, or they show up as a chemical compound. It's said that, for instance, one of the reasons that people get gallstones is because through the bitterness of thinking, the chemical equivalent of gall is generated and it precipitates.
That makes sense.
Same
thing with just stress, anxiety. All of these things. There's a chemical component, but it's you're sort of self-manifesting this into your own system.
And then what we've mentioned before is that on the other end of the spectrum, joy oxygenates the blood, and gratitude.
Yeah.
I know we're spending a lot of time on the criticism side, but one of the things from Agni Yoga gives us another, warning, which I don't think I'd ever really thought about before, and I'm not sure many of our listeners have thought about. It talks about thinking ill of the dead.
Okay.
It says, the thinker, this is taken from the Agni Yoga teaching, Super Mundane, the book. The thinker often warned people about this and said, do not condemn the deceased, for what will you say to them when you meet again? Who knows? You might have to live once more as neighbors. Prepare joy for yourself. He said the subtle world, which is the world that we move into after we've been in the dense physical world, requires a careful approach because everything there exists mentally, and earthly criticism can be extremely disturbing to subtle beings who, in turn, can respond with unkind thoughts. Retaliation reigns, especially in the lower and middle spheres, and one should not provoke it. Just because you're dead doesn't mean you're out of reach.
Right.
You can't physically interfere with hands and feet. But those living in the lower spheres, those still bound to the earth plane, the emotional plane and the lower mental, are going to register any thoughts that we're going to send out. And if they don't like it, they're going to throw one back at you.
That's right. That's that concept that you attract like tracks the like, so if you're putting out negativity, you're going to attract that negativity, even on that plane.
And the other thing I liked about the Agni Yoga teachings, it said, have you thought that it's also possible that by criticism, one may retard the evolution of beings, some of whom may be at the point of overcoming their unrighteousness? It is cruel to surround them with vibrations like the barking of dogs. In addition, people are unable to judge the motives for another's actions, and unjust criticism will only burden their karma. People judge in ignorance and thus deprive themselves of joy. And loss of joy is a great misfortune. Those who love will not criticize something they do not understand. Where there is criticism, there is not complete love.
Wow.
So by criticism, if you and I are at a point where we're just getting out of addiction, something, all it needs is somebody to, it's such a fragile step.
Yeah, I saw that so many times. Yeah.
To pull the rug from under your feet.
Yeah. And that is one aspect of the 12-step program that I do applaud, is that at least in the ones that I've been a part of and been able to gratefully be able to be a part of, is that there was a strong feeling towards this like avoiding that, especially for any newcomers. The idea was you're just supposed to hold space and just thank them for showing up, and just that sort of heavy lifting work is for later, and but I mean, just the idea of this kindness is it's so necessary right now.
Well, I'd like us to transition into that, Joey. So what else to complete your thought on kindness?
Well, I was just thinking, like, when you're trying to process all this stuff and hold it in your head, I think the sort of, where you want to plant your flag is in kindness, and start from there. And, if you can even get yourself, is this kind? Is this thing that I'm doing kind? I mean, if you could just work that one thought occasionally into your process, into your day, you're so much further ahead than most of the people walking around, because it's just something that doesn't cross the minds of a lot of people. And I wonder why that is. I know it's counterintuitive. It does seem to, there's some kind of self-preservation aspect.
It's the easiest thing to reach.
Mm-hmm.
One of the Agni Yoga quotes says, the most deadly dagger is not at the belt, but at the tip of the tongue. So we can whip it out at a moment's notice. It's right there.
Yeah.
Counting to 10 before we speak.
I think it also, we've used a lot of sort of axioms and sayings and things like that, but kindness is often mistaken for weakness. But when, at least in my life, some of my mentors, some of the strongest people who had justifiable reason to be cruel or to still went with kindness, and that strength far exceeds it takes to just fly off the handle. Kindness is that's heavy lifting.
Well, because it's harder to do than being destructive.
Yeah, it's hard. It's harder to keep that space genuinely illuminated. Like it's a heart space that can easily darken, and when those clouds roll in, it takes a strong individual to stand firm and say, "No, I'm going to be kind in this moment." Like even to myself, that's one. I know personally that's one of my areas of focus and work. Being kind to yourself. My self-criticism is so much. It's night and day compared to how I am to the outside world.
And that, I think, was the biggest gift that I was given. I had the fortune of being counseled by Dr. Assagioli back in 1970 when I was going through a very tough time. And he helped me to be kind to myself, not to be hard on myself. And,
what was some of the ways that he did that? Because I think a lot of people suffer from that.
Because I was overdoing it on a lot of levels. And he was basically just saying, look, if you feel like you want to have an ice cream, go out and buy one, make sure you enjoy it, and don't read Alice Bailey at night. Give yourself a break. Just be kind. Get into the your natural rhythm of being joyful. And he was a very loving and kind person. And I expected some sort of wonderful magic formula. Well, here's a meditation you can do, and then it'll bring you to enlightenment. He basically said, no, your task now basically is to heal. And you have to be kind to yourself because you're in charge of yourself. Who else is going to be kind to you to heal your own inner wounds, self-inflicted wounds? So I really learned from him that being kind to self is not being narcissistic.
Okay, yeah, well, that's an important distinction. Yeah,
it means that I'm responsible for this universe. I've got to take care of it. And so one of the things, and Dr. Assagioli also studied the Agni Yoga teachings as well as being a student of the Tibetan. And this is something that will sort of bridge us from criticism into the nature of friendliness and kindness. In Fiery World, Book 1 of the Agni Yoga teachings, it says, I'm concerned that you should not lose a single opportunity for manifesting friendliness. The best fuel should be preserved for the fire of the heart. The store of friendliness generates true compassion, which is directly opposed to the cruelty of fanaticism. Fanaticism knows only the egoism, which presumptuously says all or nothing. And since all is impossible, there remains nothing. He says fanaticism is inadmissible. It contains neither devotion nor love nor magnanimity, but is only a reversion to the animal state. Fanaticism begets treason, hostility, and cruelty. These are words spoken by postgraduate humans. So they're not pontificating. They're not throwing stuff at us. They're saying, look, we've traveled these paths. We know how humans can be. We've overcome that.
Yeah.
We're just not pleading with you. We're just inviting you strenuously to be friendly, be kind, magnanimous.
Yeah. It's so interesting how we're constantly trying to relearn the same, like these lessons over and over again. They're so universal and so deeply true. And it's like if someone makes a breakthrough, they want to preserve it somehow. They want us to be able to pass it on. And sometimes, even the most eloquently worded phrase falls on deaf ears,
Well, exactly, because casting pearls before time, which is another way of saying casting pearls before swine, which is the biblical text. But sometimes friendliness is like a bridge, and it's not a real friendliness, it's a pseudo-friendliness. And Agni Yoga talks about this. It says, for the last time, let us turn to friendliness as a basis of life. Friendliness is not the rouge and powder of malice. Friendliness is not a veil. Friendliness is not a mask of treachery. Friendliness is not an affable grimace. Friendliness must be understood as a feeling coming from the heart, devoid of hypocrisy. I mean, yeah.
Well, I know for myself, it was always something that I noticed very early in my time working in the entertainment industry. Is there was a sort of it's kind of a shark-filled waters, and I decided very early that that's not how I wanted to be. And even though, maybe at first glance, that cost me in the short term, in the long term, it was the right decision, and I was able to maintain a network and a community of people that were able to be kind and help each other. And I was able to give lots of people their first shot, and people were able to help me out and give me opportunities. Just that was something that I really enjoyed, actually, with being able to help people and be kind. And that sort of mindfulness, that sort of, I didn't have the words for it at the time. I'm only now going back and sort of retroactively trying to understand, these concepts. And you do that, I think, when you start going down this spiritual path. You start to, not relitigate, but reanalyze your life.
What I love about your example is that you were, maybe unbeknownst to yourself, practicing a soul quality.
Right.
And the soul quality is the true glue of relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, I was 100% unaware of what was going on. It was just, but it was a feeling, and it was a feeling that I've had since I was very young. I grew up in a family. My father was a soccer coach at a very high level, college level, so Olympic development and stuff. So, from my very first memory was of being at a soccer field, and I spent my entire life around organizations and just noticing group dynamics and playing sports at a very high level and then moving into production and leading teams and leading artists, and man, there's a lot of different ways you can proceed. And for me, I found that just it was super easy to be sort of sawed off, and that was sort of acceptable, to be that way. And for me, I was always, I would beat myself up if I slipped into that. I didn't want to be that. I didn't, and I found that it really did pay off. It was worth the time and the effort to be kind, to be understanding, to be mindful, even if I didn't understand what I was doing at the time.
Is this how you would want to treat yourself?
Right. Well,
I mean, that's the basic thing.
Yeah.
So one of the quotes that Agni Yoga says about magnanimity, it says, magnanimity can follow only after heartlessness has been cast out. Nothing is more frightful than that heartlessness which is in the pretended magnanimity that lives in the heart of egoism. Yeah. And then he gives a warning. From every manifested terror, let us turn to magnanimity. Although we shall not weary of reiterating about magnanimity, yet this is the last chance for many to realize it. Pay attention to the word last. I still puzzle on that.
Yeah. Wait, can you maybe read that one more time?
From every manifested terror, let us turn to magnanimity, which is the expansion of the heart. Although we shall not weary of reiterating about magnanimity, yet this is the last chance for many to realize it. Pay attention to the word last. I don't think it's like a punishment. It basically said there's going to be a cutoff point.
Yeah,
the requirements for entering the kingdom of the God, you've got to go through the portal of the heart. We talked about this last time. How do you move from Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga? The dark period of Kali Yuga, which we're coming out at the end of now, entering the golden age of Satya Yuga. The portal is through the heart, the gateway of the heart.
Right.
And therefore, you can't get through the gateway of the heart with malice, with anything less than magnanimity.
Yeah, that's how I felt it for me too. And there's a lot of talk now, definitely in the very spiritual communities and schools of thought. Everyone seems to agree that there's a shift happening. And in that sense, like, you think of it just like a boat leaving. It's like, if you're not on the boat, you're not on the boat.
I think that's the way to look at it.
Yeah.
And then there'll be other boats later. But this boat for this cycle
is
and so it's self-selection.
Yeah. Right, because it's not a punishment. It's not like if you missed a boat, there'll be another one eventually, but this particular one is setting sail.
It's a loving sorting out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sheep and the goats, or whatever biblical reference you're wheat and chaff.
Wheat and chaff. But it's just, it's when you talk about postgraduate humans, I mean, like, they're just, that's self-referential. You in order to graduate, you have to participate and pass a class or pass a test or go through the fire, go through the chrysalis, this is something that has to happen. And in this particular time, if you're listening to this podcast, that means you're incarnated here and you have a chance to make this next boat,
We did this 5-part series on initiation.
Yes, we did.
And during it, several times, we emphasized that the first 3 initiations have to be taken in the flesh, in incarnation. you actually have to prove it's not a written test, it's an actual driving test. You've got to be able to drive the vehicle, show that it is roadworthy or pathworthy.
Yeah. And you have to be able to parallel park.
And you can't switch on self-drive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Self-drive is a command of the soul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tesla, I don't think, is hooked up to the soul yet.
Not yet.
Self-driving vehicles.
Give it some time. I'm sure they will be.
So you and I are self-driving vehicles. The question is, who's driving?
Mm-hmm.
Who's the self-driver? Is the lower self or the higher self?
I mean, that's the question, right? So who are you letting drive your vehicle? The patterns you inherited from your parents, or from your different cultures, or different like friends, or is your true divine fractal self what?
I think that's an important point you're making, because it's saying we have an opportunity to break these old patterns, so we don't carry them on from generation to generation.
Yeah,
the sins of the father shall be visited upon the fourth and fifth generation. We keep quoting the Bible because it sort of comes to mind, but it's basically saying if you keep doing it, it's going to keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to break it. And I know we've peppered this podcast with a lot of quotes from Agni Yoga. Please give me permission to use two final quotes from Agni Yoga. I was like, this is from Fiery World 1, the first one. We have spoken about solemnity, friendliness, magnanimity. Let us complete the square with gratitude. From the most minute through the entire line of hierarchy shine the sparks of gratitude. Precious are these fires. And then the final quote from Fiery World, Book 3. It is asked, what most of all hinders every good beginning? Reply, precisely absence of magnanimity. No creative attainment, no cooperation, in fact, no community is possible without magnanimity. Beloved community, Martin Luther King. One can observe how through magnanimity labor is made tenfold easier, and it would seem nothing could be simpler during an inspired work than to wish only for the good and success of one's neighbor. Joy is the result of manifested labor. Joy is a great helper. So here endeth the Agni Yoga quotes, but I think it's the reason we use them is because they carry these eternal truisms and truths that our soul already knows, but can't always get the message to us because we're still caught up, and I'm still caught up in being critical, being judgmental, and therefore that actually brings me to a different part of the search engine. If I plug in criticism, if I plug in resentment, I'm not going to access the wisdom of the soul. I'm going to get reinforcements from everything that's stored up in that particular part of the, whatever you want to call it, the repository of human nature that reinforces resentment. So we're not only just doing this for ourselves, Joey. We are healing and clearing and cleansing and purifying group patterns.
Yeah.
Which is the other thing I love about the Ageless Wisdom teaching. It says, well, once you've reached a certain degree of purity and clarity in your own, you can't sit back and say, hey, look at me, I'm done. I hope my fellow travelers make it. No. Life says, okay, you prove you can do it. Do it to yourself. Now we're going to give you a bigger sphere of responsibility. It's called your sisters and brothers, your neighbor, your community. You're going to be taking on some of the unresolved, unredeemed karma collective because you prove you can do it. Now you're going to grow into a greater capacity to do that, which is what initiation is, a greater capacity to cleanse, to purify, and carry out the will of the Creator. So shifting to friendliness and magnanimity is not just being a nice guy. It's actually allowing the soul to take charge, to make its presence felt. And as it says in one of the affirmations from the Ageless Wisdom teachings, may the soul control the outer form.
Wow.
because we have the indwelling life and we have the form. Often, it's the horse that decides where the rider's going.
Yeah, it sure does. Yeah, the sort of monkey mind, that's it's certainly something I've struggled with in my life too. For me, like the big aha moment, or the slow aha moment was this concept of letting your feelings come and go, observing your feelings, and separating that from realizing that you're not the feeling. You're the person experiencing the feeling, and that was the first kind of step. It was the first kind of aha moment of like down a long road of process and a lot of work of being able to separate that.
Yeah, and in the last 30 years, this whole emotional intelligence has arisen.
Yeah.
It's like before, it's like, you hurt my feelings, you made me feel bad. And then we realize, no, I've chosen to have this feeling of badness arise or come up, triggered by what you just said, kind of thing. I mean, sometimes you can get too cute and not say anything.
Yeah.
But basically, we're saying that you and I are responsible for how we show up in the world.
Right.
And are we triggered by the impulse of the loving soul, or are we triggered by our patterns that hold us in the gravitational pull of the earthly realm?
Yeah.
So that's a tricky one. So what else is there in this whole thing of friendliness, magnanimity, criticism? One thing that we had talked about before we began recording was that there is another word called mockery.
Yeah.
And we said sometimes it's fun to make fun of things. I know when I lived in the Findhorn community, every Friday evening we would have a gathering, and part of what we did was a skit show. We would make fun of ourselves. It was self-reflective humor. So we wouldn't take ourselves too seriously. So we keep ourselves in right proportion. Now, once we strayed across the line and did something that hurt somebody in the audience because we portrayed them in a way that was a little off. And then we went, oh, we just crossed the line. But we knew we'd crossed the line, so we just said, okay, let's be more vigilant. So there is a place for reflection and skits and making fun of ourselves in order that we don't take ourselves too seriously. But when you use humor or mockery as a way of putting down somebody, it's like stoning somebody. You're casting stones at them. So you stone them to death.
Right.
You can mock them into oblivion. So I think there's the role,
because it's a fine balance. Because there's also the role of the gesture of humor to speak truth to power.
The buffoon,
right? The buffoon. That's right. The fool, and that this is where it gets interesting. Is writing that fine line. And I think that has to do with intentionality and mindfulness, and a real dedication to doing no harm. But that's that tough part where you have to convey something that's critical in terms of like mission critical.
Exactly. So you have to do it. You have to deliver mission critical without emotional emissions.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right.
Which I go back to my 11 words.
Yeah.
Think, say, and do that which is kind, helpful, and true.
Yeah.
That's my checklist.
Yeah.
So what else comes up when you think of this whole arena that we've sort of opened a door and walked through? And I guess it's important because we're in such a caustic environment at the moment, political environment, social environment, every which way we're condemning, we're criticizing, which doesn't mean you can't point out when somebody's heading over a cliff, you can't say, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings that they chose in the wrong way, the wrong direction. You need to say you're heading over a cliff. Now it's up to them whether they turn around. But how do you figure out friendliness to be seen as a soul strength in these times when it's so easy to show your supposed strength by flexing your muscles, whether they be political muscles, psychological muscles, just muscles in general.
I mean, I tend to fall down. I still think this is all training wheels for telepathy. Like we're working this stuff out slowly, gradually, so that we can, like, I mean, if you really could understand everything that everyone was thinking, like you're just like that's gonna be full on. You're gonna have a lot of hurt feelings, but in the process of being more mindful about what you're doing outwardly too, you're also taking more responsibility for how you feel and react. Because I think we tend to overemphasize this idea of that no one can ever get their feelings hurt. But we don't emphasize enough of managing your own feelings as well, and so, but it's a fine line, like, because there's no perfection. So there's always going to be someone says something in an unskillful manner, and it's up to you to be able to not let that knock you, like, and spin you out, and that's something that I've worked on in the past 5-6 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So rather than reacting, one can hold them saying, so this is where this person is. This is where I'm at. And I hope people have loving understanding for me and my process as I have for them. And that way we're walking each other home.
Yeah.
That's, I mean,
yeah.
And friendliness and civility. Just plain old civility.
Yeah.
Without that, we have a civil war on our hands.
Yeah. It's highly underrated, civility. And I think that's something that hopefully we can maybe move back towards that a little bit. I think it's probably something that ebbs and flows. It's probably cyclical. I'm sure every generation, or maybe every third or fourth generation, laments the sort of lack of civility, and then we maybe sway back the other way, and hopefully, but it's something that's a little lacking right now. I mean, it's really evident that, but I guess that is also indicative of a system that's out of balance.
It's out of balance because there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of wounds, and hurt people hurt people. Healed people heal people.
Yeah.
It goes back to something like that. Another cliche we're using, but it's true. Hurt people hurt people.
It is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also something that people don't really realize is, like, when you go to someone or someone is a healer, it's not that they're doing some kind of voodoo magic around you. It's that they, in essence, inspire you to heal yourself.
Come back to wholeness.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned before telepathy can only exist in a unified field. Therefore, if we are members of a unified field, we are fractals of this one life. We're not separate.
Right.
If we're part of one body, what are we doing?
Isn't that the whole thing?
Diseasing.
Is learning to be kind to yourself, and that realizing that yourself is the whole thing.
Thank you. So if self-kindness can expand to one humanity, I'm being kind to myself. Now my understanding of self is expanded to the one family of my humanity. That's the journey we're on. Painful steps. And I believe that the healing balm, the healing salve for all these caustic burns that we've caused each other through acidic comments, it has to be heartfelt, has to come from the heart. That's why I believe that the heart is central to the new society, to the new civilization, because the heart holds no grudge. The heart holds love. The heart holds wisdom.
Yeah.
And the heart bestows love and bestows wisdom. So let us be heartful, Joey.
Yeah.
Let's be mindful to be heartful.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's a good place too to kind of wrap this up. It's also the basis of that. And use yet another line. Heal yourself, heal the world. And that's what this is. Man.
Thank you, Joey.
Thank you, Michael. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Okay.